Well, it's a great pleasure to have Nicole Fleetwood, who is Associate Professor in American Studies and currently Director of the Institute for Research on Women. And I wanted to begin just by hearing about some of the courses that you teach for the undergraduates who are taking this course.
Okay, so right now I'm teaching a senior seminar, and it's theories, looking at theories of pop culture, advanced theories of popular culture. And so I'm working with seniors who are interested in doing independent research, and they're doing some fascinating projects. I have one student who's looking at the relationship between contemporary music and social media. I have another who's looking at the development of web series. I have one who's interested in kind of tracking glam rock, and so just different ways in which pop culture is actually a meaningful part of our contemporary experience. I also teach courses on documentary studies, visual culture and race, performance theory, and general kind of American cultural history, I would say.
Well, the course that I'm teaching with Rudy Bell relies heavily on visual material. In fact, it's the evidence that we use to talk about and explore 21st century challenges in relation to historic events and challenges in the past. And can you talk about why you rely so heavily on visual material and media?
Okay, I'm going to pause for a sec. Do you want us looking at the camera or looking at each other?
No, we're looking at each other.
Okay, I just want to.
Okay, this is they're a little more
so we're having a conversation.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So do you want to ask the question again, or
Yeah.
can't? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Why do you rely heavily on visual material and media in your own work?
You know, it's for selfish reasons. I'm a visual person, and I think our research has to reflect who we are. We're human beings, right? We're human beings doing research. So I like visual material. I respond visually. I think visually, and so I incorporate my own passion into my research and to teaching. And I find that students, we know about, quote, the visual turn in knowledge, where so much of the information that we interface with is through visual modalities. Right? So part of what I do in my classes is really to defamiliarize students with what they take for granted, and that's their kind of visual or optical access to information. And I really like to spend time kind of slowing down, doing basically slow cooking in class, and really, spending time thinking about the visuality of visual material and working through images with students. And I emphasize close textual analysis. I think that's a really important methodological skill that we often overlook, especially in a culture of distraction and where we scan everything. So I think the class space is a really precious, sacred space where we can all slow down and look at something together and talk about our different ways of interpreting it.
Well, great. Well, I'm glad we get a chance to do that today. The conversation that we're having is paired with an interview I did with my colleague Carla Yanni, who's an architectural historian, and the interview was on late 18th century and first half of the 19th century prison architecture and the architecture of insane asylums. And she argued that this architecture changed in relation to changing conceptions of incarceration, which moved from an idea of punishment to one in which there was a potential for inmates to be reintegrated into society, and that the architecture reflected these changing notions. And the students will also be reading a section from Foucault, Discipline and Punish. And I think that this historic past and these examples have a lot to say to your current project. And so I wanted to move into that, but begin by talking about the trajectory in your work from your last book, which I really loved, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, to your current project on prison art. How did you get from one to the other?
Again, personal reasons. As I was writing, finishing up Troubling Vision, I felt myself drawn more and more to the theorizing the personal anecdote and using the anecdote in my scholarship to get at material that might be impossible to research. And what I mean by that is I started to write about my family as I was finishing up Troubling Vision, and I tried to incorporate my family into it. And when I finished that book, I had a series of images on my refrigerator, and a friend of mine who's an art historian came over and was looking at these images and asked me about them. And the images were all from relatives who've been incarcerated. And so I kept going back to these images and kept going back to these images. And they're very painful for me to talk about and think about. And then it just dawned on me that this is my second book project, because I am interested in the personal anecdote. I am interested in the relationship between theory and lived experience. And so really my prison art research grows out of exchanges that I've had with a lot of male relatives over the course of my adult life, and even some childhood memories of visiting relatives in prison and posing for photographs with relatives in prison. So that's where the project comes from.
And you've called this project, if I understand, Prison Art and Visuality in the era of mass incarceration. Can you talk about what the characteristics of this era are?
So there are some great scholars who are doing work on mass incarceration, like Michelle Alexander, Ruthie Gilmore, Angela Davis, lots of great scholars who are doing work on it. And I definitely build upon their research, but what I do is look more at culture and art as it relates to mass incarceration. And mass incarceration is defined as an era, a contemporary era in the past, some would say the past 3 to 4 decades, where policies have changed to federally, statewide, and locally to really create a very imbalanced system where especially young Black and Latino, primarily men, but increasingly women, are getting extraordinarily long sentences, often for nonviolent, what are considered non-violent offenses, but also for often based on erroneous facts, where basically due process doesn't take place for many of them. And even when they're held as a suspicious character, they often lose recourse to having access to a reliable attorney. They're often will often settle with prosecutors, even if they haven't done anything. There's all kinds of, there are many examples of young men, like Central Park 5 is a great example of that, and that's a wonderful documentary where there were 5 forced confessions of young Black boys to something that they did not do, and they spent an extraordinarily long time in prison based off of coerced confessions.
So moving from that the contemporary historic moment and all of the challenges.
Can I pause?
Yeah.
That was kind of
that was perfect.
I just felt like but you can cut.
It was great. It was perfect. It was perfect. It was great. I was actually worried that you were going to say, well, people have worked on that, but I'm going to move on to this was providing the background.
Some context. Okay.
So we have this historic situation that poses an incredible number of challenges. And now let's talk about how it relates to visual images and art. And I just want to begin with the photograph that I think for most people characterizes an inmate, a prison inmate, and that's the mugshot. And if we begin there, mugshots are conveying information about individuals and use a particular visual language. Do you want to start by talking about what those images project about an individual who is incarcerated?
That's a great question, and I actually make a statement. I've been presenting a lot on prison art to different universities and some art institutions, and I always say I don't show mugshots unless the person who's been photographed has agreed to have that mugshot incorporated into some type of activism or an art project, because mugshots to me are really unethical images of suspicion, you know? And they're just images of suspicion. They're creating suspicious characters using visual technology. And then they circulate publicly, and once they circulate publicly, I believe that they do fix a notion in the public's mind of someone's guilt.
Right. So we understand, we read those images in a certain way, and that way implies guilt.
Based on because of the technology involved, based on kind of punitive institutions who's circulating the images. And, thinking about this is Foucault, but thinking about the relationship between punishment and knowledge also, like knowledge production. How do we produce subjects, and who's in the position of knowing and who's in the position of unknowing? And I think we often think of criminals as, in some ways, unknowing but suspicious beings. So I don't use mugshots in my work. I talk about them as these suspicious documents, and and there's been some great people like John Tagg and Alan Sekula, and Sean Michelle Smith have done really wonderful work on mugshot. Another book that I like to use is a book called Pictures from a Drawer. Have you seen this book?
Yes.
It's a wonderful book, and Bruce Jackson is the documentarian and professor who's collected a series of images these are prison ID photographs, which are different than mugshots. Prison ID photographs is the way that incarcerated subjects are indexed in penal institutions, penal systems. So these images stay in their records forever. And I'm interested in the kind of fixity of those images in terms of connecting subjects to carceral systems. So I do look at prison ID photographs as another kind of document, as a document that's really indexing. And then I pose the visiting room photography as counterpoints to these prison ID indexes.
Okay, well, let's talk about those and the contrast, because
Okay.
you reviewed it yourself.
I'm going to just get a little bit of water, okay? And just,
Yeah.
Sure.
So these visiting room portraits are staged. Can you talk a little bit about how that happens, how the backdrop is chosen, and who is taking these photographs, and how do they circulate?
So we being the Institute for Research on Women, we're actually collaborating with several Rutgers units and community organizations and nonprofits and activists on a conference on prison art. And one of the things that inspired our conference is the prison photography that takes place in visiting rooms. So what a lot of people don't know is that the backdrops are actually painted by incarcerated people. So so they're all, and there are some restrictions on what gets painted. And for example, wardens look for things like gang symbols or ethnically inflected materials. So often you have these kind of placid or bucolic images that are often might be of iconic buildings or kind of decontextualized natural scenes or the like. But they are painted by incarcerated subjects. Also, the photographs are taken by incarcerated subjects, and so it's a prison photographer someone who's incarcerated, and he or she is paid. It's his or her job in prison to take pictures. And this is a privileged position because that person is able to circulate amongst visitors in the visiting room, and they're able to interact with other prisoners. So it's considered a really highly sought after position in prison. What a lot of people don't know is that these images are quite pricey for prisoners and their family. So each image costs somewhere between $2 and $5 depending on the system and the state system. They're also something that it's a service. It's not a program. It's considered this kind of informal service that really is at the discretion of the warden. So, for example, I visited a relative in prison in Ohio in fall of 2012, and we took several pictures, and they were $2.50 each. And then I visited him a year later, and that service was no longer available because the warden got suspicious that that studio was a meeting point for nefarious activities. So it really is at each prison is a bit of a fiefdom, and it really is up to the warden to determine what takes place and the kind of access that incarcerated people have to technology, to kind of intimacy. I see the photograph, the prison photograph, as a really intimate document, because it's one of the only times when incarcerated people can pose with their relatives, when they can touch their relatives, when they can actually walk to the same space as their relatives. So it's this moment of purchased intimacy also.
Oh, very interesting. And you contrasted with the mugshot and the identity photos. What image of the incarcerated subject is projected through these kinds of staged photographs?
I mean, if you think about, you mean the posing, the posed ones? I mean, to me, it's the closest that incarcerated people get to a form of self-representation, and a really important document of belonging. Because part of what incarceration does is it removes you from your loved ones, right? And so it takes you out of your domestic context, it takes you out of your familial context, your social context. All those networks are removed from you physically in what are ways that incarcerated people try to keep in contact. So letter writing is one, and I say posing in prison with loved ones is another very important way for cultivating a sense of belonging and feelings of intimacy.
And in some of the stage photos that I looked at, they're individuals, so without their families. Now, do they send those photographs to loved ones?
Yes. So that's also really important. So, for example, that's another way of keeping in contact is the exchange of photographs. So I have an image that I will send of my cousin posing for Valentine's Day. And he sent this image to most of his female relatives. Now, this not only was it a loving act, but it was a very expensive act on his part because each image was $2.50. And when we know the pay for incarcerated people is way below minimum wage, so it was a very expensive gesture also on his part to send these out to so many relatives. But yeah, so there are studio. Ad hoc kind of studio portraits that take place in prison, usually around holidays or special events where incarcerated people can commission portraits. It's the tradition of portraiture, where we go in and we commission a studio photographer to take an image of us, and that's what is taking place. It's based very much in that kind of late 19th century Victorian tradition of portraiture.
Right, with these stunning backdrops that actually seem to mask the space in which they're taking place. But also when I was looking at them, they seem to be a lot of doorways, looking sort of views out, so conveying the impression of something outside of the walls in which they are confined. So
that is definitely one. So again, they're not. The painters are not allowed to just paint anything, and from my understanding, they're often using like landscape books as inspiration for what they. So you do get a lot of open but manicured space, but space that seems kind of ungoverned. You have images with lighthouses, water, and passageways are another. So
everything that's the opposite of the spaces in which they are
being confined.
Well, let's move to a different set of staged photographs. So I just wanted to talk about Deborah Luster's work, and she is also staging incarcerated subjects, and she did a whole series of portraits of incarcerated women in Louisiana. And I wondered what your impression of these photographs were, and what image of these subjects the photographs convey.
Deborah Lester not only worked with women, but she worked with men in prisons in Louisiana over about 3 or 4 year period. And she collaborated with the poet C.D. Wright on a book called One Big Self. And it's a really gorgeous, poetic, kind of visual essay about their experiences, and that also incorporates the narratives of their photographic subjects. So she sees her work definitely as a collaboration. And she, whoever was willing to participate, they received one of their images, but they also set the kind of parameters around how they wanted to be photographed. And I really love that idea of her seeing it as a collaboration and creating very, very intimate images of each photographic subject. So what I think happens in her work is you see individualized images as opposed to 2.3 million anonymous subjects incarcerated. She really hones in and you see individuals. I also like the idea that you see a kind of intimacy in terms of how she's able to, in some ways, take away the visual restraints of prison by often doing these really kind of close, cropped images that emphasize features and certain qualities of her photographic subject. They become these really intimate images and intimate experiences that are quite introspective, which is different than the mugshot or the prison ID.
Right.
Coerced, these kind of coerced photographs, you know. There's portraiture that's coercive, you know, so we don't, all portraiture is not voluntary, right? You know, we often, our driver's license is a type of portrait, you know, it's a state issue portrait, you know. Our student IDs are, you know, so there's all these ways in which portraiture, you know, is just an everyday quotidian practice. But I do like how exceptionally beautiful these images are.
Yeah, so do you have any favorites?
Well, I do like the one with the woman looking off to the side and with the headscarf on. One of my favorites is I think here that I'll show you. I'll show you here.
Yeah.
Is an image actually where you don't see the inmate the prisoner at all. And excuse me first, I try to not use the word inmate. But let me see if I have it. I have it in one of my. Sorry, it's of a prisoner who's holding an image of his son in his hand. You don't see any of his facial features. You just see his hand. Here it is. This is one of my favorite images.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
And I love this image because it, to me, connects with the power of portraiture to convey emotions of love and attachment. Mm-hmm. So, according to Deborah Lester, this person wanted to be photographed holding his son. Yeah. So he because he wants his son to know that he's always with him. Right. So you have both of them being framed by portraiture, but also by state institutions. One is it's a public school picture. It's the annual school picture, and the other is the father who's incarcerated. You know, but I love the emotive quality of this image.
Right, and as you said, their agency, that they're deciding what to include in the photographs, and they're individuals posing with objects or in costumes, and I think they're wonderful as well. So I wanted to move into the issue of architecture, and this still is from Artur Zumiewski's video repetition from 2005. And just to focus on this still for a moment, that in a way conveys the experience of confinement in a very vivid way. And I know that you've thought about the way architecture is used as a form of punishment, and the spatial contours of prison actually being considered to be part of a prison sentence, to be confined. How does that work? The students have have heard about the Panopticon and Jeremy Bentham. And is this a different kind of spatial contour and punishment that we see here? And how have artists used their experience of confinement in art?
That's a great question. And so there are two other artists I would say whose work might be interesting for you to incorporate. And one is Trevor Paglen. And Trevor Paglen is known for his aerial photography of and often locating these black sites, these military, and showing the connection between military industries and prison industrial complex. So he's located some of these secret prisons and across the world that the U.S. where U.S. holds, quote, suspicious subjects or insurgents. And part of what his work does is show this kind of link between the U.S. penal systems and our policies abroad. And I think his work is really fascinating. Deron Jackson is another person whose work on prison and architecture I find really, really interesting. And so what he's done is he's taken already published aerial photographs of well-known prisons, and he has painted them over with black chalk, and then he's used a kind of silver graphite to trace the outlines of the prison architecture and to really turn them into these kind of abstract paintings. And part of what he's trying to do is to shake up the fixity, the kind of what Angela Davis calls the kind of common sense knowledge that we give to prison. So we've made prison just a kind of a part of our everyday landscape where we think that it's inevitable that we need prisons. And so part of what the prison abolition movement is to say that there's another way. There are other options. And I think that Deron Jackson's work helps us to kind of shake up what we're looking at, what has just become a part of our landscape, especially in rural communities where you see these very kind of foreboding buildings with lots of light and barbed wire fences that have now taken they dot a lot of our kind of rural and semi-rural landscape in the U.S.
And at a huge expense
At a
too,
huge
and
expense.
both social and economic. Yeah. Well, let's move into another topic of art or prisons as a site for art making.
Sure.
That I know you've thought about it and worked with arts organizations in prisons, and maybe just generally what the goals of these organizations that collaborate with subjects of incarceration and artists who are inside.
So part of what I'm interested in is just the creative production of people who are incarcerated. And I think thinking of incarcerated people as productive beings is really important. And so much of what takes place in prisons is informal. That, it's a way of marking time. So people make things as a way of marking time. And those happen through informal networks of peer feedback that prisoners give each other. Inmates often will barter. So for example, I have had handmade beautiful art cards that have been made that my cousins have purchased from someone, or traded coffee for an image, a drawing. So a lot of it takes place within carceral institutions. So a lot of the art circulates amongst incarcerated people. And what I find fascinating is to think of incarcerated people as collectors who are collecting a lot of these images, that much of it stays within. But then there are lots of organizations across the U.S. that are working collaboratively with prison populations, with departments of corrections statewide and locally to do art education projects in prison. So I'm looking at some of those too. And those, they work in various ways, and some are more successful than others, and they have different goals. Some have a kind of rehabilitative goal, some have a more kind of art therapy goal. Some are really interested in producing artists who can function outside of prison and make a living through graphic design and the like. So you see different, and some are quite activist in terms of really using what takes place in the classroom to express the really terrible conditions of carcerality.
Yeah. There was one project that I thought was very interesting in which crime survivors and victims advocates collaborated on a mural, and this one, the Cesar Viveros, called Healing Walls. And I thought that's another aspect of these organizations where you bring people together to create something. Yes, from different sectors who are apart often.
And that's a beautiful mural. I haven't seen that mural, but that's a really beautiful mural.
Yeah. So do you think that these are successful in meeting some of these goals?
I think that they are really important sites for creative practice, for cultural and political expression. I do think that they bring another kind of visibility to where a significant population of people are living invisibly. So I think that the visibility is really quite important. And I think it does give us, another kind of entry point to thinking about the impact of mass incarceration on our population, like broadly, people who are incarcerated and those who are not. So I do think that these projects are really, really important for various reasons.
And you think there's a potential to change this era of mass incarceration, and that art has a role to play in it?
I certainly hope so, and I would say yes, that art has a really important role. I mean, I don't know if you know of the Town's 10-year project. I think it's called Town's 10 Years project, and it's something you might want to look at. It's a collaboration between like the Chicago Art Institute, some professors there, and grad students, community activists, and a supermax prison that is now defunct, closed in Illinois, where art was central to conveying how terrible the conditions were in this supermax. And they, through a lot of visual activism, they got the prison shut down.
Wow. Well, I have one last question, and it's how people have responded to your current work, whether in hearing the questions, does it confirm the ideas that people already have about incarcerated people, or what is the response?
I get a number of responses. One, I often get people who come up to me after I lecture and say, thank you, I've been carrying around shame. I have a relative who's incarcerated, I've been visiting, I have some of those images. I also get the majority of the people are just surprised. It's a world that they feel like they had no access to, that they actually do have access to, but it's just a kind of an awakening, because it's part of our culture. Prison is part of our culture. It's not prison as a separate culture. We are, what a scholar whose name slips in mind called penal spectators. We're witnessing this kind of mass incarceration, and that way we're participating in it, even through our passive kind of observing of what's happening. But I think the most meaningful comment I've ever gotten, though, is more than one person has said to me, wow, there's so much love in those images. And I think, if anything, I want people to know that of all the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated, there's someone who loves them, that these are loved beings, because I think that's part of the real terror of criminalization is the attempts to kind of break the bonds of love and affection and emotional nurturing.
Thanks so much for this conversation.
Thank you. This is fun.